Welcome to the second episode of Stratagems. I am excited to be here. The first episode was on Sears and how their catalog reshaped America. And today we are talking about Boeing, the airline manufacturer. Now, this story is a little bit different, right? Boeing is in the news today. I'm recording this on June 2024, and Boeing is in the news because of the 737 MAX struggles. There's been a couple accidents. There's been some whistleblowers, some unusual stuff going on with the whistleblowers, and everything else is going with that. But the Boeing that we will be looking at today is actually the Boeing in 1960. Now, the things that happened in the 1960s actually are related and connected to what's going on today with the 737, right? We'll see why this industry is so difficult. Why it was difficult in the 1960s, why it's difficult today in 2024. We will see why it is so much cheaper and less risky for Boeing to reuse an existing design than to build a completely new one. This is why Boeing took the design of the 737, which was done more than 50 years ago, and then rejigged it for the 737 MAX. Usually that works well. Sometimes it doesn't. We will see why when Boeing sells its planes, it's really selling a low number of units. The star of our show today, of course, is the 747 plane, the jumbo jet. And that plane over 54 years will go on to sell about 1,500 units, 1500. That may seem like a lot, but you got to remember that other manufacturing industries that may have also high costs, think cars, drugs, typically can spread out those sales over millions of units. And this also plays an impact in how Boeing and other manufacturers like Douglas and Airbus eventually have challenges. We'll also see what happened, with this sort of cultural change, right? The Boeing culture in the 1960s was bold, audacious. It was full of innovation. And that seemed to change, right? A lot of people seem to credit or at least pinpoint when Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, one of the competitors. And there seemed to be a clash of corporate cultures, right? Where Boeing engineers were more of the innovative kind, and then McDonnell Douglas were more focused on the numbers, which you'll see makes complete sense. This is a really tough industry. I'll say this over and over again. So being good at managing money and finances makes complete sense. But nonetheless, this clash of cultures, I think, defines Boeing today, and likely may have played a role in the 737 MAX crashes. So let's go back in time. Let's look at Boeing in the 1960s, right? We're going to see how this Boeing is dealing with the post-World War II world. They were very well known during the war. They made highly impactful planes during the war, like the B-17, B-52. But after the World War II, things change. Boeing has to adapt to a peacetime economy, and it's really tough. There's changes in air travel. There's a middle class being born in the 1950s, 1960s. This sort of post-World War II boom that's happening. The industry itself is skeptical of new planes. Again, this is a conservative industry. They're all trying to make money, and new planes are unproven, and in some cases fatal, as we see. Even back then, we had the crashes of the Comet, supersonic jets that maybe could work, but were also unreliable. And this all leads us to the 747, right? A strategy that Boeing undertakes in the mid-1960s, and which is not going to play out the way you expect it. It did not play out the way I expected it. It is not a home run, I can tell you that from now. It is a strategy that made an impact on the company, on the industry, and on society, but not the ways you expect it. The short term was very difficult for Boeing, and it wasn't really until the long term, but by long term, we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years, it made an impact. So this is what makes this strategy intriguing. Now, some fun facts for the 747. You may have flown on one if you've been lucky. They're not in operation anymore, at least not commercially. But the 747 has been influential. So let me give you a few ways in which the 747 is special. NASA actually used a modified 747 to ferry the space shuttle from the landing sites back to the Kennedy Space Center. So you can imagine how big it is that you can put the space shuttle on top of it, and then the 747 can ferry that. There's pictures of that online. The Global 747 supertanker is actually the largest firefighting aircraft in the world. The 747 has transported probably the equivalent of 78% of the world population. It's different statistics on this, but it's been a significant portion of people that have flown on the 747. About 50% of the world freight moves by 747. That this is still a role for it. Less so for commercial passengers, more for freight. And we'll see that the 747 was actually originally designed for freight. So the original design that the Boeing had for this in the 1960s will eventually pan out, but not until maybe 50 years later. The building where the 747 was built, called the Everett Building, 30 miles north of Seattle, is so big that clouds actually form in the ceiling rafters. And you can find some 747s today in some really quirky sort of post-life environments. There's a hotel, there's a restaurant, there's a house roof that uses the 747. So people have done really interesting things with this planes. And the latest 747 is still the fastest commercial plane in the world. Now, the Wright brothers, who had the sort of the first flight famously, could actually have flown their entire first flight, which was only it wasn't that long, but they could have done the entire first flight inside the fuselage of the 747 and only stay in the economy section. This is how big this plane is. This is a massive, massive plane. It is just astronomical in every way you can imagine. Now, some things for you to look for as you go through this episode. Think about some of the decision points that Boeing is going to face as it figures out how to deal with potential demand in air travel, requests from partners like Pan American, government contracts. Think of this sort of decision points. These are the key points that the company could have gone in many directions, but it chose a specific direction, which led to the 747. And think if you would have made the same decision, right? It's not right or wrong, but would you approach it differently if you were at the helm of Boeing at the time? Also think about the constraints that Boeing is facing in the 60s, right? This post-World War II environment, the difficulty in managing the economics of this industry, the pressure externally, trying to make money, all these constraints. Think about what that would look like. Your industry may not be as tough. I may actually doubt it. I think there's very few industries that are tougher than airline manufacturers. But nonetheless, we can think about how we would deal with these constraints. And finally, if you were born during the 1960s, you can of course just reminisce back to your past. If you were not alive during the 1960s, like I was not, it is fun to kind of transport yourself back to this period. This is really a wild period in America. I don't go into the politics of the period, which is of course what defined it, but it's inescapable. The feeling in the air in America in the 1960s, from the protests, the riots, but even just the boldness, right? The boldness of going to space, the boldness of building the largest commercial airplane ever. This is just a different time. Not sure if it's a time better or worse. I'll let you decide that. But think about that. This is a unique time in the history of America in which Boeing gave birth to the 747. So all that being said, let's jump right in. And let's start by understanding who Boeing was, where they were in the 1960s, and why they were really considered aviation royalty. All right. The story for this episode starts in the 1960s. As mentioned in the introduction, this is not the Boeing of today. Not the Boeing with the 737 MAX struggles and everything else that's going on as I record this in 2024. But some of the seeds of today's issues can be traced back to the 60s. The industry has not changed as much as we might think. Now, Boeing can be best described as aviation royalty. If you look through the history of aviation, whether that is military planes, really mostly before 1960, definitely before 1950 during the Second World War in particular, or if you look at consumer planes, the jet age, and everything that came after the 60s, Boeing is always there. Now, I have some numbers here for you just to give you a sense of the scale of this company, the impact it might have. In 1990 alone, Boeing jets carry more people than the amount of individuals who lived in the Earth's 100 largest cities, 675 million. the equivalent of 12% of the world's population. If you exclude the former Soviet Union, which as we know failed in the early 1990s, 60% of the jets operated by the world's airlines are Boeing built. And Boeing commands more than half the entire market for new jets on order. Now, this is not completely surprising. We know today that you really have two major manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus. Now, Airbus appeared a little later on. We're actually not going to see Airbus in our story, right? We are looking primarily at the 1960s, 1970s period, a little bit beyond that. And Airbus doesn't make an appearance at that time. But just to give you a sense, this is a company that has been highly influential. Now, Boeing naturally built an attitude, especially after World War II. They sort of had this attitude of, we're Boeing, we know how to do it. So if you want to play with, if you want to play ball with us, you'll do it our way. And you'll see this as we go into their story, right? Before we go into the consumer age of the 1960s, let's really look at where Boeing made its name and the influence it had on the war, right? I have this chart here in front of me, this page that shows the Boeing military aircraft from the 1937 to 1946. This is primarily World War II airplanes. And you're going to recognize a lot of them, right? Even if you perhaps don't remember them, the names will sound familiar, right? We have the model 299, right? The B-17 Flying Fortress. This was a 4-engine heavy bomber. We then have the B-29 Super Fortress, another 4-engine heavy bomber, XFBs, VPBs, and several other aircraft. So the relationship between Boeing and the military has always been close, at least historically close, maybe less so in recent years. So once again, we see a company that has a major influence. And even before the war, right, we had like the Model 314 Clipper, a household word on the transatlantic airways. We mentioned the P-17, the B-29, of course. And of course, today we have planes like the 707, 727, and 747, which is what our story will focus on. I came across this quote that I felt really noted the importance of Boeing during World War II. The Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata said that America's air power defeated Japan, and that the biggest single factor was the Boeing B-29. Now, the official records state that only about the B-17s and the B-29s were only around 17% of all the U.S. bombers during the war. However, they dropped 46% of the bombs that destroyed German war production and 99% of those that wreaked havoc on Japan. And about 67% of all the enemy fighters shot down were victims of the Flying Fortress. Now, the story of Boeing doesn't start here, right? It was founded in 1916 with a seaplane of all kind of plane, funny enough. It was originally part of this group of companies that would become United Airlines. And then by 1934, the Airmail Act actually forced manufacturers to split from airlines. So Boeing goes on its own as a standalone company. And our story really picks up after World War II. Now, you can imagine World War II was a unique time for Boeing. There's a huge demand for products. There's a moral imperative to build airplanes to help win the war. And now the war ends 1945. And as soon as it ended, the government canceled many orders for bomber aircraft, right? Which has been a consistent source of revenue for Boeing. It's estimated here that the total industry production dropped from around 96,000 airplanes in 1944 to 1,330 in 1946. Now, this is for military aircraft, but you got to remember, military aircraft was the bulk of what Boeing was producing during this time. So naturally, companies like Boeing turned to the commercial market to be able to supplement whatever the military orders they could find. Now, military orders will continue, right? We know in our history, right, the Cold War will pick up soon after the World War II. We're going to have the Korean War, we're going to have Vietnam, and so on. But Boeing is clearly moving away from just relying on the military, and it wants to explore this consumer market. Now, Boeing will go on to help in many other fields. You'll see this very soon, but they help with the Apollo program, with NASA, and they really tried a lot of things. They are known for jetliners, of course, but here's a list of all the things that Boeing has produced at some point in time: furniture, boats, rail cars, mobile asphalt plants, windmills, low-income houses, experimental potatoes, simulated high-speed railroad tracks, and milk. Yes, apparently at one point, Boeing used to own a herd of cows. Now, this rapid change in orders after World War II really captures how difficult this industry is. You're going to hear me say this over and over again. This is a very difficult industry. It's very difficult to operate as an airplane manufacturer. It's so many factors. There's such a high cost to produce airplanes. The demand may be unexpected. It can change rapidly. Really tough. That being said, Boeing pushes on and starts to look at its military planes, like the B-17, the B-29, and then try to figure out, okay, what can we do with them, right? Okay, can we convert them into some kind of non-military use? And we have one of the first hits the Boeing has here is called the Stratocruiser. This is a more luxurious version of the C-97 transport plane, again, the military version. It started flying in about 1947, and it was okay successful, moderately successful. 55 planes were sold. It may not seem like a lot, but you'll see that, in this kind of business, it's not bad. However, despite this moderate success, it really wasn't enough to pull Boeing out of the sort of post-World War II slump. The next plane, and perhaps the first major hit, the major commercial success that they might see, was called the Dash 80. And this plane first flew in 1954. Look at the timeline, right? 1954, war ended in 1945. This plane combined features of the military B-47 and B-52 with this large cabin size. And Boeing gambled on this. Boeing sank $16 million of the company profits into the development, but it succeeded. And the reason why Boeing sank its own profits, as we'll see over and over again, is they couldn't get enough demand from airlines. Airlines tend to be highly conservative, and they're not always willing to bankroll the development of new planes. So Boeing had to put some money on the line, which you can imagine from just a cash flow perspective can be very difficult to maintain. Now, this Dash 80 became the model for a couple other planes, one called the KC-135, and more importantly to our story, the Model 707-120. Now, this was a direct competitor to Douglas, who was producing the DC-8. Now, you're going to hear a lot of names here, right? You'll see that there's usually a major name like the 707, 737, 747, and then maybe there's a dash that explains almost like a V1, V2, V3, or maybe slightly different features of the plane. But it's okay. We're really building up towards the 747. This is the lineage that we're exploring. And this lineage started in World War II, and it went on through, the Stratocruiser and then eventually this Dash 80, which then becomes a 707, and we're going to slowly get to the 747 very soon. Now, I have here the jetliner family of where we're building up. So we just talked about the 707, released in 1956. Not bad, it would end up doing about 845 sales over its lifespan. Then we're going to have the 717, the 720, the 727, 737, which of course is still popular today. And, we see the ripples of the 737 today with the 737 MAX. And of course, we're going to get the 747, which we're really building up. And there's, eventually the 757, the 767. But the 747 is where we're building. Now, 747 will be released in 1968. So we're still a few years behind. Now, let's look at how we got there, right? Now, these big Skyliners, which were originally built of this military transport, were enjoyable, right? The 707 interior has been developed by a guy named Walter Dorwin, a company actually called Walter Dorwin Teague Associates, and was called a, quote, penthouse in the sky by news people. It's like flying 10 miles a minute in my easy chair as a passenger. Now, the 707 had the longest, widest cabin ever seen on a commercial transport. It measured 12 feet by 4 inches wide and 100 feet in length. More than 100 windows studded the fuselage, allowing even aisle passengers windows of their own. The many windows lend the interior a sense of spaciousness and a feeling of freedom. Sliding shades effectively cut out light for those wishing to nap, and in some of the 707s, there was as many as 3 lounges where restless passengers could snack, have a drink, or perhaps simply strike up a conversation. So we start to see this idea, right, that the consumers, and at this point in time, it is primarily wealthy individuals who are flying. Flying is not as affordable as it is today. I'll show you some numbers a little later on. they're getting to see this, what were originally military transports have been converted or inspired into this new commercial jetliner, starting with a 707. And it's spacious. You can hang out, you can have a drink, you can take a nap. There's a window so you can see what's going on. This is the seeds of commercial travel, right? It's still very high end, but we're seeing it. We're starting to see how it's starting to create the idea that consumers should be able to travel across the world, should be able to go from New York to Paris or New York to Cairo. We're starting to see this. Now we're going to jump a little bit ahead to the 737, which debuted in 1967. It was smaller than the 707 and 727, and it really faced some heavy competition for the Douglas DC-9 and the British Aircraft Corporation BAC-111. It was quieter, vibrated less, and could be flown with just a 2-member flight crew. And on 1987, now we're really fast forward, orders for the plane surpassed the 727, making it the most ordered commercial plane in history. So we're seeing a company, Boeing, that has thrived during World War II, at least as much as you can during the war. They're now starting to release and convert many of these designs into some kind of commercial aircraft. We see it with the 707. We're going to see it with the 737. We're going to see it with the 747, where we're building towards a jumbo jet. But the company is dealing with difficult challenges, is what we might call it, right? It's difficult to manage the financials of this plane, right? We saw that Boeing had to put its own money into the Dash 80, and we're going to see this theme. Let's now move on to the industry as a whole. Now, this can really best be described as the jet age. Now, airplanes with jet engines, which started to appear around this time, the 1950s, 1960s, at least became mainstream during this time, had a few advantages over the non-jet counterparts. They have far fewer moving parts than piston engines, so they tend to be more reliable, safer, a little less costly to operate. They burn kerosene, which is less expensive than gasoline, and produce a sort of tremendous amount of thrust for their weight. Therefore, jet planes can typically be made larger and can fly faster than the piston engine equivalents. This is going to be key, right? The 747 is going to be the biggest airplane ever built. It's going to be massive. And it can only really happen because of the advances of jet engines. Now, jetting across the Atlantic briefly became highly fashionable and prestigious, right? And there was sort of a new breed of travelers, the jet set, that emerged during this time. Now, the fares for airplanes for flying in general will actually fall quite a bit in the 1970s, which will make airplane flying much more affordable to everyone. It will even create this sort of middle class of airplane travelers that we have even today. The 747 will play a critical role there with the economics it will bring just because of its size. That being said, the air travel was really growing by this point in time, right? We're in the 1960s, going to the 1970s. Between 1955 and 1972, passenger numbers more than quadruple. And by 1972, almost half of all Americans had flown. Although we can still see the majority were actually still business travelers, right? And a small percentage were becoming repeat travelers or frequent flyers. Today, of course, we have lots and lots of people who fly. There's amazing deals, and the cost of flying is actually quite low. Wait till you hear some of the numbers of what it cost to fly during the 1960s and 1970s. I have a quick chart here of the growth of domestic air traffic, and it's just a completely up and to the right curve, right? Starting from the 1950s all the way to 1965, it's growing much faster than any other form of transportation. Auto, bus, they are growing slightly, but air travel is just tremendous. And there's the airline capacity here, the U.S. scheduled airlines. In the 1950s, this looks to be available seat miles. So in 1950, there were perhaps less than 24 billion available seat miles. By 1955, this has grown to about 45 maybe. 1960, there's almost 90 billion. And by 1965, that's about 125 billions of available seat miles. Again, what the numbers mean may not be as important. What I'm trying to convey here is this a huge growth in air traffic and air travel, especially in America. This is where we're really focused on the story, and you'll see why in a second. Now, the first commercial jet airplane was actually the British de Havilland, the DH-106 Comet. It was powered by 4 Ghost turbojets, and it flew in 1946. The test was successful, and the British Overseas Airways Corporation, the BOAC, placed an order for 16. Now, fun fact here, the Germans actually made some great progress on jet engines during World War II. And the effort was continue after the war. I don't have this detail here, but I do wonder if this is one of those research points that the Allies were able to acquire after the war and being able to secure many of the scientists that still remain in Nazi Germany. That being said, the British are flying the first commercial jet airplane. They have some new engines, right? The Ghosts, and this is really bringing forth the jet age. Now, the Comet only really had 36 seats, so it was very small. It cruised at about 490 miles per hour, which was about 190 miles faster than the Boeing Stratocruiser. Remember we talked about earlier. The range of the Comet was only 1750 miles, but there was a feeling that this limitation could be improved with better technology. The issue the Comet ran into is the accidents. Within a year of the airliner's entry into the service, 3 Comets were actually lost in very highly publicized accidents that happened mid-flight. 2 of these were found to be caused by a structural failure resulting from metal fatigue in the airframe, something that wasn't really well understood at the time. And the other was overstressing of the airframe during flight due to severe weather. So the Comet introduces the jet age, but then sort of burns in the sky, which is a terrible publicity for airlines. Remember, airlines are generally conservative, and there's this conflict between airlines and airline manufacturers like Boeing. So the airliners were, of course, aware of the Comet's fate, and they were wary. There were doubts. For example, they weren't sure if pilots who were schooled in the piston engine model could actually fly this jet engines. And there was even concerns that, could people on the ground, I have a quote here of a little old lady in the street, could they adjust to the terrific increase in speed of being inside one of these jet airplanes? And of course, they assume correctly that the faster the airplane goes, the more catastrophic a crash would be. So Boeing had some of this technology from the B-47. We talked about this, right? So they converted it into the Stratocruiser. And now Boeing is trying to make it in this jet age. It's trying to put forth an airplane that airlines would actually buy, that they'll be comfortable buying, operating, and then making a profit on. Now, speaking of profit, one key factor for airline operators was cargo. Now, there's a study conducted at the time, and the study, which is sponsored by Boeing, in full transparency here, it did note that air cargo had much greater potential in the international market than domestic, but it played a role in both. And it found that the ability of carrying cargo would help airline operators be more profitable. They weren't sure, even at the high prices of this era, if they could actually run airplanes profitably. So cargo was going to be a major factor here. Now, I love this quote here about what's an ex-Airbus CEO, Jean Pierson. He was a CEO from 1985 to 1998, I believe. And he said, "You can't win, you can't break even, and you can't quit." I think this is a great way to summarize this entire industry, right? We see the difficulties. You have these companies who are making advances like the jet engines, but then they have these catastrophic crashes, which make airline operators even more wary about going into business or buying these airplanes, and just the economics are difficult. Now, I have some costs here, some budgeted costs and actual costs for some famous airplanes. If you look at the Boeing 777, which we won't get to in this episode, the budgeted cost for this plane was $5 billion, and the actual cost ended up being between 12 and 14. For the Boeing 787, it also had about $5 billion in budgeted costs, and the actual cost ended up being $32 billion. Now let's look at Airbus, which again is not in our story, but will eventually be a key player in this industry. The Airbus A380 had a budgeted cost of $10.7 billion, and the actual cost was 33.9. The Airbus A350, a very famous plane, had a budget cost of 5.3 billion, and the actual cost was 10 billion. Perhaps not so bad. The Bombardier C Series, another manufacturer, had a budget cost of 3.4 billion and an actual cost of 6 billion. And the Mitsubishi SpaceJet, which was never completed, had a budget cost of 1.4, and the whole project was shut down after it actually reached an actual cost of 9.5 billion. So what we're seeing here is these are really expensive products to make. They are difficult to deliver on time, on budget. We see it. It's not just Boeing, right? It's not just Boeing is inefficient at making airplanes. We see it with Airbus. We see it with Bombardier, and even with perhaps random companies like Mitsubishi get into it. It's also not the same. If you look at the plane that Boeing developed in 1952, which was the Dash 80, if you remember, Boeing spent 186 million on that. So if we look at the 707, remember this is sort of key plane in this lineage that we're building up for the 747, the jumbo jet. Boeing spent 186 million developing this airplane in 1952, and this amount was 36 million more than the company was worth at the time. Just to give you a scale, right? It's not only expensive, the company has to put in more money than what it's worth to develop one single product, hoping that this will work out, hoping that they will get enough sales to break even and then eventually become profitable. Now, this airplane manufacturing is a little bit different from cars and drugs. Two other items where we might have high development costs, high R&D. Typically, cars and drugs might spread their costs over millions of product sales, right? Even, small manufacturers, if we see like electric cars today, it might have hundreds of thousands of sales for their models. And the ones that don't are likely not going to be in business very much. The market for commercial aircraft, on the other hand, is really much smaller, right? In 2024, there's only around 1,000 large jets that are sold for the year. And not all of them are exactly new. They might be, refurbished. So this is really a small market. You got to remember, right? The Stratocruiser, the Boeing's first sort of commercial plane, sold 55 units, which was not a bad number at the time, but not enough. There's also a concept here I came across as I was researching this episode, right? This idea of learning curves. And high volume products like cars and drugs, they spend most of the time on a relatively flat portion of the learning curve. But jet airplanes, and just airplanes in general, don't really have the ability to really get onto this learning curve. There's not enough volume for them to do it. If you imagine you're producing 1 million cars, by the time you get to 100,000 and then 200,000 and then 300,000, you're going to improve the process along the way, right? You're going to improve the way you produce. You're going to find optimizations that make it cheaper and more reliable as you go forward. But when you have an airplane that may only produce 1,000 units over its entire lifetime, and this is 30, 40, 50 years, it's hard to get into those learning curves. It's hard to really find the optimizations and make it work. The other challenge that manufacturers like Boeing, they need to scale where the puck will be, right? They need to develop some kind of aircraft that airlines would want for many years. So it's not just enough to have a car that someone might then trade in 5 years. That airplane might need to be in operation for 10, 20, 30 years. I believe the 747s don't really fly too much commercially these days, but they flew for maybe 50, 70 years, right? So they need to guess. Now, on the other hand, guessing is a bit of a tightrope, right? If the program gets delayed, so if they promise airlines a specific plane within 2 years and that gets delayed, they may cause lost orders. We'll see that with the 747. Maybe a lack of confidence. And of course, customers might go into another competitor, whether that is Douglas or Airbus today. Global events can actually shift the trends very quickly. If we look at Airbus, they actually had a struggle trying to sell the A300. And 4 years after its introduction, they had only sold 38 of them. But then there were increased fuel prices from the second oil crisis. There was more competition from other planes, and the A330 happened to fit that perfect bill, those new trends. And by 1979, this is about 5 years after the introduction, sales had climbed to 300 units. So as all this changes, right? We're going to see this deregulation that's going to come into the American airline industry in the 1970s, which is going to change the dynamics and the economics of the industry. All of a sudden, the planes that made sense up to that point no longer make sense economically, and airlines need to change. It can also be said, when we look at Boeing with the 737 in the 60s, just before the 747, it's a big factor of that success was that the Douglas competitor, the DC-9, actually experienced production delays. And that made the 737 much more likely to succeed. And even if you succeed at everything, you sort of skate where the puck is, you make the economics work, you somehow stick close to your budgeted costs, somehow, the reward is not that great. Between 1970 and 2020, Boeing, which is the most successful commercial aircraft builder today, averaged about 5% annual profit. So this is, just really tough all around, right? There's an expert on jet aircraft manufacturing, John Newhouse, who estimated in 1982 that of the 22 commercial jet airlines that had been developed up to that point, only 2, the Boeing 707 and the Boeing 727, were believed to have made any money. Though he does know that the 747 might eventually make that list, which I think it does. So this is the industry, right? We saw the situation with Boeing, tough, post-World War II. We have now seen the industry itself as it enters the jet age, just a really tough industry. And this is where Boeing is trying to make it work. This is where Boeing is going to try to release the 747. So let's see how Boeing actually comes and does that. Now, before we do that, though, there's a couple of things I want to do. First, let's look at the era, right? What was the 60s in the US? Why do all of these elements actually make sense during this time period? The 60s. It has many names: the culture decade, the crazy 60s, just the 60s. This is a time in American history and in many other countries that is really quite unique. Historian Dr. Terry H. Anderson really described it as this long decade of endless pageant of political and cultural protest. Now, there's a lot of things that are going on at this time. Some are relevant to what we're talking about, some are not, but it is worth noting, right? We have the assassination of JFK, MLK, Bobby Kennedy happens in 1968, if I remember correctly. The Vietnam War, all kinds of protests and riots that make today's protests and riots seem quite tame. You have civil rights is going on with the legislation that Johnson will eventually pass. The Cold War, for example. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and so on. So this is a really fascinating era. Now, there's some dynamics here that are making the jet age of what we talked earlier and Boeing possible. They're making it at least a little easier for them. Now, there was an ad at this time by General Electric, GE, where it would say, progress is our most important product. So this is also what's in the air, right? This is the idea that you can do anything, you can build anything, you can create these great companies, and this is the era in which Boeing lives, right? Boeing just, even though the company is somewhat struggling to make it work after World War II, they also live in this era where it seems like anything's possible, right? I mean, the space program will appear very soon. So there's all these interesting dichotomies in this era. Now, the boom from 1945 to 1973 was occasionally interrupted by recessions, but then it kept rolling. It's really the longest in American history. It occurred through Europe, Japan, especially as many of these nations rebuilt, right? We know in Europe, the Marshall Plan will eventually rebuild many of the European cities. Japan will also get plenty of aid from the Allies. But America was really the richest, and richer than any other country or bloc had ever been. They were really in a great position after World War II. You can imagine a country that had all this demand coming its way, which Boeing benefited with the amount of planes that were built for the war. But it's also a country that left unscathed, at least from the perspective of the cities and the landscape. No American cities were really destroyed heavily. So America was in a great position to take advantage of this huge boom that happened over this sort of 20-year period. Now, the number of births jumped by 19% from 1945 to 1946, and then another 12% the next year. And then it settled down for 3 years and continued to boom into the 60s, right? This is where we sort of get the baby boomers. Now, more babies were born in 1948 to 1943 than in the previous 30 years. Now, the first boom was really a makeup for sort of wartime deprivations. I will say, even though American cities were not destroyed, there were rations and limitations during the war, as you can imagine. It is hard to manage this sort of war economy without the consumer economy suffering in some way. But this boom in babies really kept going, right? Beyond any suppression that may have happened during the war. And it really seems like this boom happened primarily in countries that were not destroyed by the war. The US, of course, but we have Canada, we have Australia, we have New Zealand, and so on. And it was just led with what Laura Keynes once called relentless consumption. So this is what we're starting to see building up through the 60s. Now we see advertising become much more common in this era. And now we had this medium, the television, which was perhaps the most powerful way of penetrating the American consumer. And in the 50s, the tube, so to speak, was a toy. But then eventually television became quite common, and it allowed them to imagine a whole different world. Now, there's other things going on as we get into the 1960s. In 1960, the U.S. becomes the first society in the history of the world with more college students than farmers. And by 1969, the number of students had nearly doubled to 3 times the number of farmers. The number of degrees granted, undergraduate and graduate combined, doubled between 1956 and 1957. We also saw some erosion of sort of public institutions at the time, based by many of the political scandals we have all become familiar with. But the point here I want to underline is there's a very large number of individuals who are going to college, who are getting undergraduate degrees, postgraduate degrees. We know we had the program from the war, the GI Bill, which allowed soldiers to go to college. And what this is creating is a middle class. It's creating a class of individuals who will eventually have enough money to afford air travel. And as air travel becomes cheaper, it will be even more possible. But this is what we're seeing. And it's also a middle class that's not just more educated, of course, but perhaps with higher expectations of what their money should buy. The first episode of this podcast, we did Sears, and we looked primarily at the farmers, right? The farmers in late 1800s, early 1900s. And for many of these farmers, all they really wanted was the ability to buy or have multiple choices when they go to their local store, right? And the Sears catalog offered that. It gave them lots of choices to buy. But this consumer that we're going to see in the 60s is different. They are accustomed to a grocery store with thousands of products. They're accustomed to big retail stores. Sears, of course, by this point has big box stores. Macy's has big box stores. So they are looking and expecting new things, and air travel will be one of those things. Science was the faith of the time, right? It seems like knowledge solved all problems. We're going to see the rise of knowledge work too during this time, right? Drucker will eventually coin this word, and it would become this key part of the economy. And even things like polio, right, which had a major fear, seemed to end on a positive note when a vaccine was developed in 1954, right? It was sort of a miracle brought by scientific knowledge. The nation itself was also becoming more homogenous. So retail franchises like Sears and Macy's and so on were making individuals just much more similar to each other. Of course, television accelerated this. The automobile was transforming cities. Suburbs were becoming this sort of huge expanses of land. Suburbs are kind of interesting, right? It's almost like a modern farmer where you don't live in the city, but you don't farm. You can just drive to your job. You have the interstate highway system, which was spreading across the nation. And of course, you have new routes popping up with this jet airplanes from Boeing that are being put forth by many companies. And now going from coast to coast now took as little as 5 hours on plane, right? Now, the question of equality has to be covered here, right? This is a big theme of this era. The airlines themselves were not legally segregated, but airports often were, right? Especially in the South, inferior airport accommodation discouraged African Americans and other minorities from flying. There were complaints about airlines, but really nothing seemed to affect that. Of course, airlines do not control local airports, and they're not gonna necessarily get involved. It's the same thing we might see today, right? It's a political issue that may have no positive resolution for the airlines. So by this point, at this time in the 60s, airline is mostly for white individuals. Now, I'm just saying this as just a matter of fact. It's what we're seeing, but it's going to open up more and more to more individuals as we go later into the 60s and into the 70s. Now, the first women will not pilot a commercial airliner until 1973. And of course, women made up the majority of flight attendant professions in the 60s and 70s. There's actually a video in the bonus content that shows you what it's like to fly, and you'll see sort of very stereotypical stewardess, female stewardess, who dress very fashionable in a very fashionable way. So the experience of flying is improving, right? We saw that with the introduction of this big sort of military transport planes that have been converted to commercial planes. We're going to see the cost of flying go down. Air traffic, of course, is growing. We saw that earlier. I have some comparisons here of airfares, just so you see how they change over time. Now, this comparison shows a link between LAX, and Boston, BOS. So in 1941, the number of stops that you would make between this route would be 12. Just think about that. 12 stops. The flight duration would be 15 hours and 15 minutes. And the cost would be $4,439. This is in 1941 dollars. Just so you know. Then in 1978, the number of stops between, again, LAX and BOS would be 5 stops. The flight duration would be 11 hours, 50 minutes. The cost will be around $915. So, we see about 80% drop in price. By 2015, there's a nonstop flight. It's 6 hours, and the flight costs $400. And by 2024, it's again nonstop. It's 5 hours and 10 minutes. So it has improved from that 6 hours. And the flight is actually $119. So it's another 70% drop from 2015. So the cost of flying is truly coming down. Now, something else to note here is the airport fees have actually increased quite significantly over the same time period. The typical airport fee for a ticket has risen from $1.65 in 1978 to $29.70 in 2024. Just so you can see how much the cost of flying has decreased over this time period, right? So this is a wave, and in the 1960s, Boeing is at the start of the wave. Now, as the planes get faster, the trip times decrease, and of course the passenger numbers increase to make the economics work. Airlines start to change their approach. So the very plush service that became very known in the 1950s, the whole penthouse in the sky, started to go away, right? They were, of course, expensive to operate, and it started to give way to a low-fare night coach service. This would eventually become known as red eyes. We still have today, of course. And the fun fact here, passengers start to experience physiological problems due to crossing several time zones within a few hours. It wasn't really known at the time what it was, but it would eventually be known as jet lag, right? And this came from this era as well. So the flying itself is changing. It's going from that very plush first class service only to, let's have more and more people. Maybe we'll introduce classes, so we might still have a first class, but it's going to be much smaller, much more exclusive. And we're going to have this bigger and bigger coach or economy class, which is, of course, the model that we end up with today. Another fun fact, the nonstop transcontinental services also allowed sports leagues to be able to actually play in different cities. So, for example, the baseball league, the MLB, could actually now expand, and the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers actually moved to California, but they could still play in other cities as they used to. So this is the 60s, the culture decade. So to summarize, right? Boeing in the 1960s was aviation royalty. They played a huge role in World War II. As the war ended, they were trying to figure out where their revenue will come from. So they're going into this jet airplanes, the Dash 80, eventually the 707, 737, and of course the 747, which we're building towards. We saw the economics of the industry overall, very tough, high expenses for each product, a low number of units for each one, just a very tough industry to crack. In the 1960s, very tough to do even today, even as Airbus puts pressure on Boeing. And of course, we saw the 60s itself, this rise of a middle class that was expected more, and jet flying, it's going to be one of those things that this middle class expects. And these are all the trends, all the things that Boeing is looking at to determine the next step, the strategy, right? So Boeing decides to build a big airplane. Now, the story of how this airplane came to be has a couple sort of turns in the road, but this is a strategy they decided to undertake in the 1960s, especially towards the late 1960s. And they're going to build the 747. So they believe this model could do it all, right? They could have more capacity for more passengers. We saw this. It could also help with cargo, which is going to help with the economics. It's going to give better rates, more profit for airlines, and of course, hopefully Boeing, if they can do it. And it's going to come, just like the previous airplanes, it's going to be from a military contract. So they'll build a design for a military aircraft. The aircraft will not go forward, but they're going to have the design, and they'll convert it into a commercial plane. Now, is this the right strategy? Is this the right approach? We'll see. But this is where Boeing is going next. So let's dive into the jumbo jet. Now, we had all this background that we needed to understand everything that's about to happen with this plane, with the 747. Without that background about Boeing, where it came from, the industry, the jet age, the culture of decade, some of the stuff will not make as much sense. Now, the origins of the 747 can be traced back to the early 60s, when the U.S. Air Force Military Air Transport Service sought an all-new high-capacity airlifter to increase its capacity in Southeast Asia and throughout the world. Know this, right? That was a trend, Southeast Asia. What's going to happen there? Eventually it's going to be Vietnam. Now, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, they all immediately announced their intention to enter designs. If the design were to be chosen, then Boeing could then go and produce this planes, right? The goal for the design was to be able to carry 750 fully equipped troops anywhere in the world. So just to give you the number of how many people are supposed to fit in this plane. Now, the comfort level of these troops, most likely doesn't matter as much, but that's really the goal. That's sort of the size of what they're going for. And as we saw before, if the military were to accept this contract from Boeing, they could develop this plane in a much more comfortable way, right? They know the military will eventually pay. They can sort of build to spec or build to a specific order. It's less risky. Now, at the same time, as this is happening, there's an airline called Pan Am. Now, Pan Am doesn't exist anymore. It went out of business, and you'll see some of the signs for why perhaps it went out of business. But Pan Am was also forcing Boeing to develop a big plane, right? It wasn't called the 747 then, but they were talking about this kind of plane, right? And the Pan Am boss, Juan Trippe, which is a key character in the story, really told Boeing, if you build it, I will buy it. So this guy was bold. He just believed in going big. And to him, a big airplane, even bigger than the 707, could really represent Pan Am's global ambitions. So he was telling Boeing, hey, build this, I will buy it, I will be the first one to put orders in, do it. Now, eventually, Boeing is going to lose out on that military contract, so it will not go ahead with that military aircraft for those 750 fully equipped troops. But the design is going to prove handy. It's going to especially prove useful for this request from Juan Trippe from Pan Am. Now we saw the introduction of the 707, 727s. The first customer of actually those planes was also Pan Am, Pan American, and they had a very close relationship. He actually, thought that people thought he was crazy because he was one of the first airlines, in fact, the first airline to place orders for the 707 and then put the 707 into service in 1958. So really, the commercial jet airline business really took off with this sort of bold decision by Juan Trippe to buy the 707 and to put it into business. Now, the 747 wasn't completely new. It really built on the 707, on many of the elements that were created then, but it was just so much bigger. Wow. It's so much larger than everything that you might imagine. To give you just the range, right? The 707 had a range of about 6,000 miles, and the 747 will eventually have range of about 7,000 miles on top of that. while being able to carry way more people and way more cargo. So it flew faster, it flew longer, and it was significantly bigger. So the jet would become so big that would eventually be coined the jumbo jet, which Boeing did not like. They did not like the name at all, but the name stuck. Now, Boeing assumed that a large proportion of 747s would actually be for the cargo version, right? Remember the cargo economics being a key factor in how airlines make money. So it designed the cockpit perch on top of a single deck. So there'll be a nose door big enough to load 2 8x8 containers side by side into the sort of cargo hold that the plane has. So cargo was initially this key factor, or this big selling point for the 747. That being said, on December 22nd, 1965, Juan Trippe from Pan American signed a 5-page letter of intent agreeing to buy 25 747s. Now, he wanted a guarantee that Pan Am will receive the first 5 aircraft built, and then 5 of each of the first 3 batches of 10, and 5 of the next 15 of the production line. So keep in mind, right? He's going big. He wants this big airline that there's never been a jet as big as the 747. He wants it, and he wants a lot of it. Now, is this going to be safe? Is it going to be reliable? Is it going to be profitable? Hard to say, but he's going for it. He really wanted to make the 747 Pan Americans own for as long as possible, right? Now, Boeing needed to sell at least 50 747s just to recover its pre-production costs. Just to recover. So they need at least 50. Now, they have 25 from Pan American, so not bad, halfway there. But we're not talking about profit yet, right? They're not there yet. Now, each of these 747s were going to cost Pan American $18 million. So this was a $450 million investment. And the terms of the contract meant that Pan American was going to pay $250 million of that 450 before the first aircraft flew. Kevin, think about this economics, right? However, the future seemed rosy, right? In 1965, which was a very profitable year for Pan American, it was forecasted that 35 million people would be flying the intercontinental routes, and forecasters were predicting a 200% increase by 1980. Gotta remember this. The idea at the time in the 1960s was that air travel was going to continue to increase. We're seeing this huge increase all the way from 1945 to this point in time, or 1965, and it's going to keep going until 1980. Right? It's not going to pan out exactly like that, but this is the conditions in which Pan American is making this big bet, and which Boeing is also making this big bet because they have to produce this plane. Now, Juan Trippe sold this to his board, and he told his board that each 747 will replace 2.5 707s, just to give you a sense of the scale of the plane, and they will operate at a 30% less seat mile cost. The 747 will also take 25 minutes of each crossing, this transatlantic crossing, and the traffic was expected to increase by at least 15% a year into the 1970s. This is a key number I saw pop up multiple times. It's almost like a very nice, easy round number. 15% increase a year into the 1970s. Now, the board voted to approve the purchase of the 25 747s with an option for 10 more. And with some spare parts and some extras that the contract had, the total amount was actually $550 million, which at the time was the biggest commercial purchase in the history of aviation. So there's big money going in. Now, Boeing has its intent. Now, this is not bad, compared to some of the previous models we saw before. At least Boeing now has a commitment from Pan American for 25 of them. It's not enough to break even, but, it's likely enough to start, enough to avoid Boeing putting its own money to develop this plane. So let's look at a little bit of the construction of this plane. There's a lot of sort of fun facts about how this plane was built. Just everything about this plane is massive. That's what you got to remember. This is just massive in scale all around. So there were about 75,000 engineering drawings that will be used to produce the first 747. There were about 15,000 of wind tunnel testing, which was quite innovative at the time, actually. The wind tunnel testing is a way for the engineers to test how the plane reacts in different conditions without actually flying the plane. It's you can imagine it's a great way to find errors and flaws before you actually put the plane in the air. The wind tunnel testing will take place in 8 locations in the U.S. Now, on paper, it was really just a larger 707. Now, 2.5 times bigger, of course, and it had a wingspan of 53 feet greater than the 707, and its fuselage was 79 feet longer. But everything is just on a large scale. It requires 6 million parts, 3 million will be fasteners, and half would be rivets. It had 4.5 million movable parts, with 171 miles of electrical wiring and 5 miles of tubing. The wings were 190 feet, 8-inch wide. The whole plane would weigh 376,000 pounds, more than the 707. It would accommodate between 363 and 409 passengers, at least the initial models. And this is more than 200 passengers compared to the 707, and about 125 tons of cargo. It was expected to cruise at Mach 0.84 or around 650 miles per hour, which was faster than the Boeing B-52. This was the military aircraft during World War II. And the first 747 had a range of 5,290 miles. There was also some cool technology in this plane. It had the first inertial navigation system, the INS. It was actually a recent innovation in the 90s. It was developed for use of U.S. nuclear submarines and for the Apollo space program. But it basically allows point-to-point navigation without the need for sort of ground-based aids. So it's just a better way to navigate through system. And the 747 actually has 3 INS systems. Now, the fuselage is actually about 225 feet long in total. Its tail was as tall as a 6-story building. The cargo hold would have room for about 3,400 pieces of baggage, and the whole thing could be unloaded in 7 minutes. So it's just, incredible. And now, this is the plane itself. We have to imagine about where this was even constructed. And so Boeing considered 50 locations for its main production facility for the 747, and it eventually settled on one 30 miles north of Seattle, so very close to where I am right now, in Everett, Washington. Now, to level the site, they had to move 4 million cubic yards of earth. The production was so rapid. Again, they had this order from Pan American, but Pan American wasn't going to wait forever. So they really rushed a lot of the production. And it was so short that the first 747 full-scale mock-up was built before the factory even had a roof above it. And rain actually affected this first mock-up and caused mudslides that cost $5 million to clear. So if you imagine this, right, the budget cost versus the actual cost, these are the things that really start to put a dent, right? They tried to build the first 747 so quickly because of logical constraints that they did not have a roof in the factory, and that caused mudslides, which then caused damages. Now, the plant itself in Everett cost $200 million to build. It had a 9,900 feet runway, which was planned around the main building. And it would eventually become the largest volume of any building in the world, 205 million cubic feet. It's actually still in use today. Now, the 747 employees did such a great job that they were actually called the Incredibles. And they actually got T-shirts for this because for a long time they were working in this plant without heat and, of course, without a roof. So the Incredibles was a name given to them. Now, the size of the 747 is going to cause some challenges, right? This larger aircraft means longer boarding times, a slower turnaround times, right? The 747 actually forced airlines to make significant changes in their loading and unloading techniques. They require more entry-exit evacuation doors. This actually, the 747 was the first jetliner to offer a double-width passenger entry doors, 5 on each side of the fuselage. And even the airports themselves, the Pan Am primary terminal at the Kennedy International Airport in New York had to be rebuilt in 1968, just ahead of the 747 launch, which cost $216 million. And a new maintenance facility at the same airport cost another $98 million. So this is just a major big airplane. It's causing airlines to change how they operate, how they load people. It's even causing airports to redesign their terminals to be able to fit this huge plane. Now, the 747 is going to fly for the first time on Sunday, February 9th, 1969. The 747 was airborne for about an hour and 16 minutes. So not too bad. It was a successful flight. Now, the major challenge that the Boeing had here with the plane was actually the engines. There's a lot of discussion here on how they chose the engines, but they ended up with an engine called the JT9D, and it was a major troublesome factor for the 747. No fewer than 87 engines broke down, and 55 engines had to be made during the entire test program. Now, the testing program itself had to be the most extensive ever undertaken in commercial aviation history. In addition to those laboratory tests of parts and components, there were 5 superjets that Boeing used to test the program. The 5 jets had logged about 1,400 hours of flight time in about 1,000 trips. And that at that point, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, was happy, and it gave the certification on December 30th, 1969. Now, there's a quirky point about the story here. At this point in time in aviation history, airline manufacturers and even airlines, maybe to a less extent, really believed that the future of air transport was going to be supersonic transports, short for SSTs. So at the same time the Boeing was sinking money into 747, the U.S. government was quite fearful about falling behind in the sort of the supersonic jet race, with the Soviet Union and with the Europe's Concorde. So the government actually chose Boeing to design a supersonic jet, and the company was going to receive some money from the federal government to develop this jet, perhaps initially with a military use and maybe eventually commercial use. Now, the supersonic jets never really took off. That's really the conclusion here. The money that Boeing sank, which is about $500 million, would get paid by the government. So Boeing did not lose too much, except, I guess, time, if you look at that. But the only supersonic jets to really see regular service were the Concorde and the Tupolev Tu-144. The last flight of the latter was in June 1978. It was actually, and for the Concorde, the last flight was actually in October 2003. So the supersonic jets didn't seem to be economically viable, maybe too difficult to operate. They just never really took off. But the 747, from Boeing's perspective, was really seen as a stopgap until the supersonic jets will take over. In fact, they expected that by the late 1970s, there would be around 1,250 supersonic jets, such as the ones Boeing was building with the government, to really completely take over intercontinental passenger market. And the 747s will be converted into freights, again, mostly for cargo. But again, the entire supersonic program was abandoned by the government in 1971. So Boeing is building the 747 thinking, you know what, this is a stopgap. It's probably going to be cargo long term, but it's okay. We'll do it. Some of the things that eventually killed the supersonic jets are the excessive noise generated by them, high development costs, even more than this sort of jet airplanes. They were very expensive construction materials, high fuel consumption, high emissions. You can imagine this plane will not do well in today's climate change era. And really an increased cost per seat. Again, all the things that do not vibe well with an industry that is looking for optimizations anywhere it can. Now, the 747 will eventually be released. Pan American will take over. We'll look at some of the results of the 747 in the next section. But just to fast forward a little bit here, by the end of 1970, there were about a dozen airlines who were operating 747s. Pan American, of course, Continental, Northwest Orient, United, National and Delta in the US. And in Europe, we had Lufthansa, Air France, Iberia, Japan Airlines, and Asia, of course. And really, in the 5 years after the first aircraft went into service in January 1970 with Pan American, the 747 really established itself as probably the safest and most dependable aircraft in airline history. Now, before the 747, no new aircraft flew as many as 500,000 hours without a fatal accident. Insurance companies, assuming that there will be a crash of some kind, they actually have predicted the 747 will suffer 3 fatal crashes in the first 18 months of operation. During the first 10 years of service, there were 5 fatal crashes, 3 of which were pilot error. And besides this, of course, there was a 747 on September 6, 1970, which was hijacked by terrorists and then flown to Cairo, and then was blown up on the ground. So this is a plane that will prove to be very safe, will prove to be somewhat profitable for airlines and somewhat profitable for Boeing. It will have some benefits, but it's not a full win, as you'll see in a second. Now, at the end of this production period, Boeing made it, right? They made the deadline. They had some issues there with Pan American with some delays, but they were able to renegotiate a little bit. And now the jumbo jet has flown by 1970. So what are the results, right? Now that Boeing has this jumbo jet, what's going to be the impact on the organization, on the industry, and on society? So let's look at the results and the impact of the 747. We know where Boeing was in the 1960s before the 747. We know where the industry was, and we know where consumers were as a wider society. Let's see how things change after the release of this massive jumbo jet. Now, in the way the gamble succeeded, Boeing held a monopoly in this very large passenger aircraft production for many years. Now, the get in there was not easy. During the final months before the delivery of the first 747, Boeing was forced to request additional funding to complete the project. There was a consortium that came together to provide funding, and Boeing's survival depended on it. Now, by 1970, remember the first 747 will go into production on January 1970, Boeing's debt had exceeded $2 billion, with $1.2 billion owed to the banks, which was a record for all companies at the time. Now, the number of orders of the 747 were attractive, right? So if you remember, Boeing needed 50 orders to break even. So in 1966, when the project started, they received 25 from Pan America with an option for 10 more. So here's some of the numbers of orders in those first few years. In 1966, they had 83 orders. So as soon as Pan American came on board, other airlines jumped on the wagon too. This is also a key number, right? They needed 50 to break even. So they are able to hit that in the first year. They don't get all the money up front, of course, but it's looking positive. In 1967, they do another 43. 1968, they do 22. 1969, they do 20. 1970, 20, and then this drops. In 1971, they do 7 orders. Then it slowly increases to 18 in 72, 29. It will reach a peak again in 1978, with 76 orders. In 1979, there will be another 72, and in 1980, 49, and then drops again to 1981. Now, by 1982, it is down to 14. It would kind of hover there. It kind of peaks again in 1986 with 84 orders. 87, it does 66. Goes on. 1990 actually has 122. And then it slowly starts to decrease until it gets to the last order, which I have it here for 2010. So in that period, from 1976 to 2010, about 44 years, Boeing will eventually do 1,524 orders of the 747. It will deliver 1,431 of those. So this is not bad, right? Remember, right? Now, the financial situation is tough for Boeing. Just the cash flow situation is just really tough to make it work. But this airplane as a single unit will be profitable for Boeing. It will provide resources. Now, is it enough to make the company successful? Hard to say, right? If you remember, the profit that the company might average over this period is only about 5%. So it is not a huge moneymaker type company. But the 747 will prove successful. Eventually, Airbus will enter into the fray, put in even more pressure on Boeing. Now, just to show you how difficult the short-term cash is, though, in 1969, again, 1 year before it gets released, the company profits were only around $10 million. In the late 1970, early 1971, we know that the U.S. government is going to cancel that Superjet project. Boeing, by that point, had about $1 billion in debt on that project. Luckily, they got some of the money back from the government, but they did have to lay off thousands of engineers. And the Boeing workforce was reduced by 2/3, from about 150,000 to 50,000 workers. Fun fact: the sale of the of the supersonic jet mock-up was actually sold to a Florida promoter for $43,000. So keep in mind, right? The 747 goes live. It goes into operation in 1970. But at the same time, Boeing is reducing the workforce. Not necessarily because of 747, but just simply because another project, the supersonic jet, did not work out. It had a lot of debt and not a lot of revenue. So this is what we see in this industry, in this company, right? You can have a great product, you can have a great strategy, but other products can easily weigh you down, right? A single plane development could put you $1 billion into debt. And even if you have 100 sales of a successful product like the 747, it might still be tough time all around. Now, the 1970s were really tough for Boeing, right? This is not an easy time. Despite the numbers I just told you about the 747, this was a difficult time. The US entered a recession. The sales of commercial aircraft actually slowed down. We saw that before, right? We saw that in 1971, there were only 7 sales, and it wouldn't actually peak until 1978 with 76 sales. So for most of the 70s, that the Boeing is not having a good time. The 787 had not yet established itself in the market, right? It took some time for airlines to take on the planes, to put them into operation, to get them used to all the things you might expect. Here's another number in terms of workforce, right? The Boeing workforce plummeted from about 80,000 in the early 1970s to 37,000 in 1971. The impact was so great that there was actually a billboard put up on the city of Seattle that said, "Would the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" So this is just a really difficult time. Now the current president, last name Wilson, we didn't really cover him too much. He remained in his post until 1972, and then Malcolm Stamper, who actually led the 747 program, took the post, and he held that until 1985. In 1972, the company also changed the organizational structure, really having 3 major units: the Boeing commercial airplane, under which the 747 would be, Boeing Aerospace, and the Boeing Vertol for helicopters. This is just an interesting quirk here for you. I actually have the org chart for Boeing. So the airplane company was really the largest, right? You had new programs, you had operations, you had contracts, sales and marketing, customer. They were usually divided by division. So the 747 was its own division, as you can imagine. Then you had the 707, 727, and 737 of its own division. There was a 767 division, a 757 division, and there are a few other things. There was the Boeing Aerospace Company, which we saw here before, actually did space and information systems and missiles. So again, selling to the military for missile systems. There was still a Boeing Military Airplane Company, and you still had some programs here with the B-52, B-1, and some other military transports. And then the Boeing Vertol Company, which is the helicopter company. And you have other things like Boeing Computer Services, Engineering Construction, Marine Systems, actually. So Boeing is really trying to diversify, right? They're not looking at their cash flow. They're not looking at this sort of tough economics from building airplanes and thinking like, man, hopefully we survive. They're trying to do something, right? And this diversification is something that Boeing tries to go after. It doesn't seem to have that much of an impact, at least not on profit, but just something that Boeing tried to do. Now, eventually, the 747 will prove to be a very popular freighter. It will carry around half of the world's air freight when in operation. It will eventually do a freight variant, more than even the first version, called the 747-8. It was named the 747-8 Freighter, and it was a variation of the 747-400, which became the most popular version of the 747. Remember, right? The dash are like V1, V2 of the same plane. Now, the final 747 will be delivered to Atlas Air in January 2023 after a 54-year production run. And as of December 2023, 64 Boeing 747s, about 4%, have been lost in accidents and incidents, in which a total of 3,746 people have died. So generally quite safe, And we know that some of those accidents were actually pilot error. So less so the failing of the structural plane or something like that. So Boeing did crazy things, right? They built this great jumbo jet, and it came back from the attitude, right? Remember the attitude of, we're Boeing, we can do whatever we want. There was a saying within the company, right, that says, we will have the really difficult things done by tomorrow, but the impossible will take us a bit longer. So this is the mantra, the the philosophy that's driving Boeing, right? It gets asked to build the biggest airplane in history. No problem. We'll do it. It gets commitment from Pan American, which helps it offset costs. And even though it had a commitment, we still see Boeing going to serious debt, serious layoffs, a very difficult situation in the 1970s. Even with all that, eventually the 747 will be successful as a single product, as a single plane. It will have a major impact. We're going to see that in a second here with the industry and the society at large. But this is the company, right? It's, when I first started doing this episode, I really thought there was going to be this sort of big blockbuster strategy that Boeing undertook with the 747, but I can't say that, it was just, the decision made sense. And if you zoom out over 34 years, yes, those individual sales numbers make sense for the 747, but it's just such a tough industry that perhaps even making good decisions does not always save you from the economics. The reality of the economics will assert itself even if you make all the decisions right. And that's really tough. It's sort of bittersweet it's hard. It's just a tough industry. Now, that being said, let's look at the industry itself, right? So we know how things went for Boeing, good and bad, definitely tough in the short term, better in the long run, depending on your perspective of what better is. But for the industry itself, the 747 did have impacts as well, right? Now, the introduction of the 747 also coincided with the sharp downturn in international passenger air traffic. Remember, right, there was a prediction of a 15% increase per year all the way into the 70s. But in 1970, there's a worldwide recession, and the air traffic was only actually growing by around 1.5%. This is really not something that could have been predicted. Yeah, it is what it is, right? The 747 have been developing now for 4 or 5 years. So it's just, again, the toughness of the industry, the expected boom that will come. There will be a boom later on in the late 70s and 80s. That's not happening here in the early 70s when the 747 is first rolled out by Pan American. Now, for decades, the 747 will be the standard wide-body aircraft for the big global carriers. So Lufthansa operated about 30 747s, really one of the largest European fleets. At its peak, British Airways had about 57 747s based at the London airport. Qantas had an old 747 fleet for 6 years, from about 1979 to 85. And if we look at the rise of certain airlines like Cathay Pacific and even Singapore Airlines, it likely would not have been possible without the 747. In Japan Airlines and All Nippon Airways used large 747s for short domestic flights for many years. So the plane is becoming hugely influential for airlines to make their economics work with a combination of cargo and with a combination of just simply a large number of passengers, making these planes a more profitable way for these airlines to operate. So in a way, the Juan Tripp's ambition really forced many of his competitors to follow. We know that even in the first year that Boeing started to build the 747, it had plenty of orders from other competitors. But Juan Tripp gets the credit because he went first. He's the one who lit the fire. Now, there's an ironic twist here because the early 47, really apart from the early years in Pan American, never really played an important role for the major U.S. carriers. United Airlines and Northwest Airlines, which is now part of Delta, long ago retired the last of their 747. Pan American, of course, and Trans World Airlines are long gone. They went out of business. In fact, this partnership that Pan American and Boeing had on the 747 may actually have contributed to Pan American's downfall. You can imagine that the Pan American was so aggressive in trying to expand that when the recession hit in 1970, they were not ready for it. But this is not the only factor why Pan American went out of business. Now, the development of the 747, specifically that Dash 400, which is the most successful version, also led Airbus to develop and launch the A380 in 2000, which it cost the European manufacturer unheard losses. Let me see if I have it here in my notes what the A380 was. Yeah. The budget cost for this airline was $10.7 billion, and it ended up costing $33.9 billion. Wow. So this is Airbus trying to match what Boeing did with the 747. And actually, the lack of sales of the A380 actually caused Airbus to terminate this plane about 22 years after its launch, compared to Boeing, right, which had about 54 years of production. Now, the 747 also led to, or at least contributed to, a congestion problem that we have in airports today. In 2001, Boeing and Airbus agreed that air traffic will continue to grow about 5% annually over the next 20 years. This is 2001 into basically today, 2024. But the two airlines actually developed different solutions to the airport congestion problem. Boeing really had a philosophy of direct flights. It sort of had built this idea of, you have a bigger airplane so you can have a single direct flight. So it really focused on enlarging the 747 and redesigning the wings a little bit so you can have more and more passengers in each plane for a direct route. Airbus really wanted to go the other way and tried to focus more on what became the sort of the hub and spoke system, which is still used today, of course. So this big airplanes where the 747 or the A380 would play a role in big direct routes where the economics might be more appealing for airlines. And then if you have to go into smaller routes, so you have to do a layover into a smaller city in this hub and spoke system, you're probably going to take a smaller plane, which is why today, you might find yourself in a 737 or something even smaller. So the industry was changed by the 747. Not right away, definitely not in the early 1970s, but it was, especially internationally. The 747 just really changed how some airlines operated their routes and the economics that came with it. Now, if you look at society itself, the 747 provided air travel for a bigger customer base, right? It was 2.5 times bigger than the 707 or the McDonnell Douglas D78. And that fact really changed the economics of wide-body operations. The lower unit cost for intercontinental trips really eventually translated into more affordable airfares, allowing this larger middle class, which we saw was building up in the US in the 1960s, but really all over the world, to be able to afford to fly. So the 747 would become a key factor for what we will not call globalization, right? It allowed more and more people to travel larger distances at cheaper prices. The 747, of course, as we saw before, forced airports to change its structure to accommodate these big jetliners, which is sort of laid the foundation for today's air travel. And it's been described as audacious, the 747 really being a product of its time, a product of a time where anything's possible, right? You want to go to space, you can do it. You want to build the largest airplane possible, you can do it. That's really the mindset of the 60s that can be captured in the 747. And the 747 also became known for just crazy levels of luxury. Some airlines, for example, would put a piano bar in the economy class, mostly in the 1960s. Some of the Continental's models had lounge with sofas. Again, right, you had so much space that you could afford to make these little small changes and create this more luxurious experience. And we still see the 747, in other parts, right? We see actually the Air Force One, typically the plane that carries a U.S. president, is typically a 747 that has been modified. We saw it play a role with NASA for some years to be able to carry the space shuttle into the air. So Boeing had to redesign a few things. So the 747 changed things for the middle class consumer, right? It didn't have an impact on civil rights. It didn't have an impact on equality, or maybe yes, maybe you can argue that it did. By making something that was exclusively a product of the rich, of people who have a high income. By making it more affordable, perhaps it did, right? Perhaps the ability to travel across the world may have had a larger impact on society than not, right? Maybe that's a point that's could be worth debating. But that is the 747, a plane that was a success for Boeing, not in the short term, but in the long term, that changed the industry. Some ways good, some ways bad. Some of the early pioneers, like Pan American, did not benefit as much, and it changed society. It allowed the middle class to be able to fly at cheaper rates, especially seeing some of those rates we saw before between that LAX and Boston comparison. Before we finish, let's look at some final insights, some final questions that we can take on from this episode for your own organization. Wow. So what should we take away from this episode? It is not a home run strategy, right? It is not a strategy we can say, wow, this company did this, they took a huge gamble, and they really paid off. This is not what we can take away from the strategy. I really think there's three things that you should be thinking about going forward. First, industry economics are really like gravity, right? They are inescapable. Boeing has continued to have difficulties due to its fundamental challenges with the economics, right? They actually did what can be say a really good job with the 747 and the production, all being said, and the number of orders and deliveries they did over its 54 years. But the company itself, the economics are just hard to escape, right? And if we look at today, what we see today with the 737 MAX, which if you notice that in the name, right, this is a plane that was built on the 737, which was originally designed in the 1960s, right? The 737 would be designed around the same time as the 747. And the reason why Boeing prefers to take an existing design, like the 737, even if that design is 50, 60 years old, 70 years old, is because designing a whole new plane from scratch is so expensive and so risky. So they take an initial design, they try to adapt it to the times, and they hope that works. And in some cases, it does not, right? So we see the 737 MAX having significant challenges. There's significant challenges in how the company operates and its production. But this is, to me, a logical conclusion from really tough economics. The boldness, the audaciousness of releasing the 747 might not be appreciated today, right? Remember, the part of what made the 747 possible was just the era. The 60s was just anything's possible, right? We'll make it work. We'll eventually find the money. So this industry economics are just really all around you. So what do they look at for your organization? What kind of things you have to put in place for that to deal with them and then make the best decisions possible? Number two, boldness means going first. So we do have to give credit to Boeing, right? Boeing did something that wasn't necessarily impossible, right? We see they had a design that they submitted to the military, so they feel confident it could be done. They were really building on the 707, even though it was two and a half times larger. So it wasn't necessarily something impossible, but it was difficult, right? It was a big gamble. And, Juan Trippe went first too, right, as Pan American. It perhaps didn't work well, but there is something about that boldness, about taking a leap. I do think that leap has to be reasonable. No one's saying go and spend twice what the company's worth trying to build a single product and hope that works. But there is something about boldness, right? And there is something about that culture of innovation that I do think Boeing has lost today. And many people look towards what will eventually become the merger of Boeing and Douglas McDonnell in the, I want to say, early 90s, where the culture seemed to clash, and that culture of innovation that Boeing had all throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and even, of course, even if you look at the 40s, is not quite the same today. So that boldness, innovation culture needs to be there. And by taking those big risks, Boeing was able to move the industry forward in a way that was different, even different from what they expected, right? They were expecting the supersonic jets to be the future. The third point, the third insight is we have to be wary of predictions, right? This prediction of 15% growth every year into the 1970s did not pan out. There was good evidence for it. I mean, we see the chart from the 1950s to 1969, and that evidence is solid. But predictions are just predictions. It's hard to say how they will change. And in an industry that is known to be even more unpredictable than usual, it needs to be even more conservative. In the 1970s, there will be regulation, or in this case, actually deregulation, that will come to the airline industry in the U.S., which was also a big factor in the drop in fares going forward. So just another thing that would make the economics different. Actually, when that deregulation will take place, the 747 would fall out of favor for U.S. carriers, where it wouldn't make as much sense to have a 747 fly a short domestic route. That being said, right, it's just the same thing. Could anyone have predicted that the 1970s was going to be a wave of deregulation? Probably not. Or the travel increases or decreases? Hard to say. So these predictions, we have to be wary of them. We need to make decisions that might give us the most options in the future to deal with them, but avoid believing them as fact. It's clear that Juan Trippe believed it as fact that this air travel was going to increase no matter what, and that's just not the case. So that's it. That's the second episode of Stratagems, the story of Boeing and the 747. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing to The Growth Needle. Be sure to check out the bonus content. There's several videos that I use in my research and you'll find interesting. This era is close to us, right? We're 1960s, 1970s. So luckily we have lots of color pictures, lots of videos even showing this time. And it's nice to be able to see a video to understand what air travel really looked at in the 1960s or the 1970s. It is different from today. So check that out. There'll be a post on the website that you can look at. If you have questions or comments, feel free to send them to my email at rubenjagarta.com. And we will talk soon.